Welcome to On Becoming a Healer. Once a poem gets under your skin, you can't unread it. You can't unhear it. You can't unknow it. Those are the words of American poet Bianca Spriggs. To her observation, I add my own. Poems sometimes show us what we can't see or can't hear or can't know in any other way. And for those of us who are doctors, what we don't see and don't know in the lives of the patients who see us can matter enormously. Sometimes we can learn a great deal by reading and listening to the poems of people who've been our patients. They observe our presence or our absence. So it's poems we're going to focus on today. And we have a special repeat guest. But before I introduce her, let me say hello to my co-host, Saul. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So what are we doing with poems here?
Well, our guest has picked out three from a range of poems that teach us about the perception or experience that people with serious illness have when their doctors are not present for them. And we've talked a lot on prior episodes about problem of physicians not engaging with patients, holding them at arm's length. These poems are very accessible, and so I'm looking forward to talking about them, and then also to talk about why we think that we are so prone to doing this to our patients. Again, it's great to have Laura back. I think at this point we can call her our podcast scholar in residence.
Yeah, so our repeat guest today is Professor Laura Greene of Augustana College. Hello, Laura. It's great to have you.
Great to be here, Stefan.
Saul introduced a little bit about why we're interested in this, but I know that you teach literature and you teach literature that concerns illness. I'm wondering why poetry? What does it have to say about illness just set us up a little bit.
I think actually you set it up pretty well in your introduction. I mean, poetry is concentrated meaning. You're using as few words as possible to say as much as possible and to give as many resonances to that meaning as possible. So it's particularly useful when you're trying to convey something complex, particularly the complexities of living through and experiencing an illness. It's a very different use of language than the kind of medical language that doctors are used to. It's deliberately allusive, metaphorical, not straightforward and objective necessarily, but those allusions and metaphors bring alive and help us understand the actual experience of being ill in a way that medical terms, I think, do not.
So it is great, Laura, that you were kind enough to pick three poems for us today. The first poem is called Poem for Dr. Blank. Do you want to say who the writer is and sort of what we're doing with this?
Sure. Her name is Anya Krugovoy Silver. She was an English professor and professional poet who had inflammatory breast cancer and lived 14 years with it and wrote several books of extraordinary poems about the experience of illness. It's really...
She's available on YouTube. You can search for Anya
Yes.
Silver, and she's there reading her own work. She died
Yes.
in 2018. Now, this particular poem begins with a quote. It's from a Hungarian poet, and I'm actually of Hungarian descent. I just want to highlight that the author of that first line is Miklós Radnóti, who died young in 1944 in the Holocaust.
Poem for Dr. Blank, Anya Silver. Smear me with black rage from head to toe. That's Miklós Radnóti. Tear up the sad page, rip its stitching from my book, ink over its watery lines. Untwist the lids from my tubes of blood and pour them down the front of my gown. Mark me gruesome. Now bring in the doctor. Let her tell me again that my treatment is a crapshoot. Let me hear her say, 6 months is better than nothing, then shrug. This time, I will not reach for the tissues she carelessly flicks toward me. Rather, I'll lean toward her face and scream, one long, munch-like howl. I want to watch her face turn human. Let her smell the meat of me, the wick.
Wow, what's going on as you understand it?
I mean, it's a Poem about fury. The opening lines seem to refer to some other way of talking about what's happening to her. The sad story of this poor lady weeping over her condition. Those first two lines just dispatch with that story. Tear it up, get rid of it, ink over the watery lines.
Oh, you poor thing with cancer. Must be so
Yeah,
tough for you.
right,
Oh, so
right.
difficult. But I hope the treatment works.
Yeah, yeah.
That's sort of the conversation, right?
I think so. And it's also probably to some extent the narrative that she is pushed into by the medical professionals when she says, "This time I will not reach for the tissues." She carelessly flicks towards me. So she's saying, "I'm not going to just dissolve in tears." And she marks that difference by using this image of these vials of blood, which have presumably just been drawn for some sorts of blood tests, and says, "Unscrew them and pour them down me, down my gown. And mark me gruesome." So she takes us out of the realm of the kind of neat medical space wherein blood is contained in these vessels and marked with labels and sent to a lab, and it's all tidy in a weird sort of way. And she wants to take that blood back and pour it on her body and then have the doctor come in and force the doctor to see her as somebody marked with blood, as somebody suffering, and then sort of dares the doctor to say, "Okay, now that you're seeing what this really does to me, now tell me, well, it's a crapshoot, or well, 6 months is better than nothing." And then she's like, "I'm going to lean toward her and scream."
Right.
That famous
Painting, right.
painting by Munch, the Scream, which is, it's on emojis everywhere
Correct. There's
now.
an emoji for it in my phone.
Right. And her goal is this arresting line: "I want to see her turn human." And then I love the last line too: "I want her to see the meat of me."
Saul, I'm curious what your favorite line is.
I want to watch her face turn human. Silver has to really up the ante in the hope of breaking through
Yeah,
this impenetrable armor that her doctor is wearing. She's like, I have to lose it. And I want to lose it. This person is holding me at arm's length, this person who is supposed to be there for me, to take care of me. And the thing is that the physician in this case is so inaccessible. And it's almost like, what can I do? It gives us a sense of what remove the doctor is holding themselves. And I think the question, of course, is why? Why does the doctor do that?
Why? Okay, Saul, why?
It would be useful to just look at the other poems and see if there's a pattern here. I do think that that's something that we have to confront, is what's going on. Is it just that the doctor is bored, disinterested, busy, doesn't get it, or is there something else going on? And I think those are the questions that I'm hoping we can ask. But we'll see whether patterns emerge from what these other poet patients have to say.
I want to share my favorite line or
mm,
passage from this poem and also comment that I have opposed reactions, contradictory reactions at the very same time. But I particularly feel it when you read, "Untwist the lids from my tubes of blood and pour them down the front of my gown. Mark me gruesome." It is a horror movie to me. That
yeah,
is, and it's vandalism. It's just like vandalism of the medical process, and it sounds like a horror movie, people streaming blood. And so
yeah,
it's violative. And as a Gen X person who came up with punk rockers, I like the idea of people, but certainly patients, violating the code and
yeah,
saying, "Screw you, screw this. There's another story and it's mine. Get out
yeah,
of my way." And I really value that. And I have an opposite reaction. And I feel terrible for the doctor in this situation.
mm,
I
mm,
mean, the doctor was told to give patients a Kleenex. I was told to give patients a Kleenex. The conversation probably is something like, it is a crapshoot. 6 months is better than nothing. It's probably not very good. And I have a strong suspicion this doctor is not ready for the act of vandalism that's happening in this visit. And so I feel bad for the doctor, whoever that is.
I think you've captured the chasm between these
yeah,
two worlds, and the question, of course, is what do we do with that? And I think that's something we can wrestle with. But yeah, I think there's this chasm between teaching us to hand people tissues and to say things like, "Yes, I understand. This must be so difficult, and it must be hard for you." Yeah, and the patient who's just like, "Where are you? Who are you? Why do I have to play along with this?" And so I think that's what she's talking about.
Well, I was just going to say one thing that interests me about this poem, given that I've read a bunch of poems about illness, is not there are lots of poems about what illness does to you, what it feels like, but this direct address to a doctor, even naming the poem to Doctor Blank is a little unusual and strikes me as part of that in your face thing. That it's not just about violating the medical process, it's about directly addressing the doctor. And I think with the full knowledge that this doctor is not ready for this, that just as you've said, and wanting her to not be, wanting her to take it all in a sort of bloodbath. And I mean, I understand what you're saying about kind of feeling sorry for the doctor in a way, because part of the problem is this stuff is hard to talk about as a doctor when you can't offer a good treatment. You can't offer anything more than the promise of a few more months. That's a hard situation to be in. And people tend to say stupid things when they're
But the
in
one
these
the one
kinds
thing
of.
you can offer is your presence.
Yes,
And
I
that's
agree.
what doctors are
I agree.
withholding. And I think that's where she's
Yes.
reacting. Also,
Yes.
what's interesting is that the title, like Home for Dr. Blank, on the one hand, you get the sense that she's thinking of one particular doctor, but you also see this as a title that could be addressing many doctors.
Exactly.
A good portion of it's like, hey, doctors, this
Yeah.
poem's for you.
Yes.
The
Yes.
Dr. Blank is all of us at what, perhaps.
Okay.
Laura, would you like to introduce our next poem?
The next two poems actually weren't originally written as poems, but a doctor at the University of Iowa named Lorene Herwalt became interested in patient experience and spent time interviewing people who had serious illness and what their experience with the medical profession was like. And then she took those words from the interview, mostly as verbatim, but occasionally, I guess, editing a bit out here or there, and cast them into poetic form, meaning she put in line breaks and played with the spacing on the page. And I did that in concert with the interviewee. When poets take language that appeared in the world in a regular form and turn it into a poem, that's often called a found poem.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
I've heard of that.
The title of this one is Classic Example, and it's by Nancy Mayers, who was a wonderful writer, essayist in particular. She had a, a very severe case of multiple sclerosis, I think, when she got it when she was 29, and she didn't have a kind that remits and gets better. Hers just it got worse and worse, and she did ultimately die from that just a few years ago and was by the end completely debilitated.
Hmm.
She wrote a book called Waist High in the World about living with disability. She also has a famous essay called On Being a Cripple about
Wow.
disability. And she also suffered tremendously with very serious depression even before her MS. So she's had many interactions with the medical world. Okay, so this is the found poem based on her interview called Classic Example. A psychopharmacologist I was working with to find an antidepressant. I finally fired him. Came in to talk about the drugs I was taking. He never looked at me. He sat on the edge of the sofa, looking at his lap, taking notes, never physically relaxed, his shoulders rigid. I laughed and said, "Have you heard of the great molasses flood?" He said, "No, but is it pertinent?" A vat of molasses in Boston broke. Molasses oozed down the street. A number of people drowned. Horribly. That's how I feel when I'm depressed. So it was exactly pertinent. But I couldn't say anything except, yes, but never mind.
Yes, but never mind. Saul, what's your favorite line?
My favorite line is when the psychopharmacologist responds to her question with, "No, but is it pertinent?" It's such a
Yeah.
medical way of talking and captures the chasm between her question, "Have you heard of the Great Molasses Flood?" which then goes on to describe a historical incident which, for her, evokes severe depression, the drowning in molasses. And we can talk about that. I had to go to Wikipedia. Yeah,
It's a tragic event.
it's a
It really
tragic event. Yeah,
happened.
we'll talk about that. But that response of no, but is it pertinent? To me, again, captures the mindset of the doctor in his very medicalized, extremely narrow, protected shell.
Yeah, I mean, this is a psychopharmacologist. They are there to treat depression, and they weren't ready for this, I guess, molasses curveball. Laura, is it fair to ask if you have a favorite line out of a poem, or is that
Not at all. I think that line, "A number of people drowned," and then there's a break, horribly. And that is how I feel when I'm depressed. I mean, I'm so impressed with the metaphor. I
yeah,
mean, because, and this is where the objectivity of science and the insistence on a particular kind of vocabulary and a particular kind of language can really constrain doctors, I think, because
hmm
you could come up with various, symptom lists to talk about what your depression feels like. I'm sure there are medical,
Oh, there's
terms
questionnaires. There's
for it.
standardized questionnaires.
Yeah. Walking into my doctor's office and the nurse is taking your blood pressure, and then they run they ask you the depression survey. Do you have any, have you take no pleasure in things? You blah, 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 blah. And I mean, again, I feel sorry for the nurse. She's got to say this a jillion times, but like, it's reading out those warnings on drug boxes or something.
Doesn't really inspire you to want to answer
It,
the question.
no.
Yeah, yeah. So just for example, I'm going to present a couple questions to you. Below is a list of the ways you might have felt or behaved. Please tell me how often you have felt this way during the past week. And I will want you to answer on a scale of 1 to 5. Rarely or none of the time is less than 1 day, but if it's most or all of the time, you need to say that because that's 5 to 7 days. And the first one is I was bothered by things that usually don't bother me. Was that rarely, some, little, occasionally, moderate, or most or all of the time? And the next one is I did not feel like eating. My appetite was poor. So when we can go all the way down to I felt sad. Um, I'm sorry. Oh my God. I felt sad. And I want to know, just please specify, was that rarely, some or little of the time, occasionally, or a moderate amount of time? And we are going to create a numerical score.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, this poem by Nancy Mears, she kind of decided not to do the questionnaire today.
Exactly. I mean, it's like that survey that you just talked about. It's like the test tubes that contain the blood.
Oh, yes, exactly. That's a great comparison.
Yeah, and I mean that the metaphor, which is just not. It's not simply drowning. Bad enough. It's drowning in molasses. This thick, viscous, kind of slow moving, but just desperately clogging liquid.
Yeah.
That gives you a kind of insight
Yeah.
into the terrible heaviness and stuckness and muck of her feeling. The metaphor can do that. And the Likert scale of I feel sad, or I'm not eating, or it just doesn't do that. So it's, I mean, I think I'm not a doctor, not a psychopharmacologist, but it seems to me that if you discourage patients from using metaphoric language, which is a very human thing to do, metaphor is designed to take something unknown and make it more known by referring to common experience. If a doctor rejects that sort of language, I think they reject information that would actually help them.
Hmm.
And she says that explicitly. She says, so it was exactly
Yes.
pertinent, but I
Yes.
couldn't say anything except yes, but never mind.
Yeah.
Because she understands at that point that he's not going to get it.
Right.
And by the way, just from a historical perspective, the great molasses flood occurred in Boston in the North End in 1919. A huge molasses tank burst, and it was a catastrophic event in which 21 people were suffocated as molasses poured into the streets, and 150 others were injured. And it swept away buildings and homes, and apparently for decades after that, the smell of molasses permeated the north end of Boston. But anyway, that is her metaphor. And as Laura says, it's vital information that isn't captured by the PHQ to
Whatever.
whatever you want to
Yeah.
use, right?
CESD, all of them.
Oh, yeah.
But isn't it like I want it to do my job as a psychopharmacologist, hypothetically, I need to know how bad you feel. I don't need to know how you feel. I need to know how bad you feel so I can record it and adjust your meds. That's sort of where this sits. It's like there's this divide. I don't want to know how you feel. I just want to know how bad it is,
Yeah, but
preferably on a
don't you
numeric
know
scale.
better how badly it feels when you hear about drowning in molasses than you do about a 5 on a Likert scale?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this poem gets a little closer to the question of what's going on with the physician.
Yeah.
In the first poem, the physician is not really present. It's just
Yeah.
we're just seeing the rage. Here, the physician is described as basically a wretched soul. I mean, that's not said,
Yes.
but he's described as never looking at me, sitting on the edge of the sofa, never physically relaxed, his shoulders rigid, and all he can say is it pertinent? And and so the thing is, he might come back and say, well, we need these. We need the score. We need your PHQ score. But really, are these scoring systems really there for purely scientific purposes, so we can determine which drug to use, or are they serving another purpose, which we don't like to talk about, which is that they're protecting the physician and the profession from the reality of the suffering and the complexity of what they have in front of them?
Yeah.
And I think that's where I think Nancy Mayer is maybe going, at least as I see this.
There's also a famous writer and physician, Abraham Verghese. He talks about metaphor a lot. And I'm looking at an article of his called The Physician as Storyteller. And he quotes another writer, Cynthia Ozick. He says, as Ozick writes, through metaphorical concentration, doctors can imagine what it is to be their patients. Those who have no pain can imagine those who suffer. Those at the center can imagine what it is to be outside. The strong can imagine the weak. Illuminated lives can imagine the dark. And he talks about that, metaphor is this bridge. It reaches across. It invites the very thing that you were saying, Saul, the doctor here is trying to protect himself against. It invites a kind of imaginative understanding of the patient's situation. And he says, medicine used to be full of metaphors like that. And he mentions like the mulberry molar, which was such an interesting thing that I looked it up. And it really does look, there's a tooth that really looks like a mulberry.
Almost everybody still has one. So the one that remains, at least that I know, is it felt like an elephant was sitting on my chest.
Yeah.
I'm not saying patients have to say that. There's no script, but it is one we all hear, we all resonate with, we all know what it means, and it connotes something beyond it was intense pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I think this insight about metaphor is useful, but greatly understates the problem. I think it understates the reality that that physicians are terrified of going anywhere near the suffering. Sometimes they may use a metaphor almost as a way of putting something between themselves and the reality of and the humanity of the person in front of them. They love the line, "Oh, it's like an elephant sitting on your chest," and you're taught that as a medical student. Yeah, but really, sure, if the patient says that, it's a useful clinical sign, but that's still a chasm away from being present for the individual person, the unique individual who's in front of you, who is terrified that they're going to die and who is in pain. And I think that in this particular poem, we see in the very first few lines that we're dealing with a physician who is just so uncomfortable with the humanity of the of the patient who in this case writes the poem. And the molasses story is a very personal one. It's really her evoking something that she knows about that really captures for her what she's going through. And again, she realizes by the end of the poem, and it's interesting because she talks at the beginning about how I finally fired him.
Yeah.
And and the question, of course, is did she fire him at the end of this appointment? Did she fire him
Oh,
two
or
or three
later.
appointments later on?
Yeah.
I think that it became clear to her that this guy was not going to cut it. But the thing is it's so hard to let your doctor go because you're counting on that person. They play such an
Yeah.
important role, and you'll tolerate, as a patient, you'll tolerate a lot of stuff that falls far short of what you need because you're so used to the fact that doctors are not likely to be present for you. And
Yeah.
so, but at a certain point, it crosses a line. And that's why she says at the beginning, almost offhandedly in the middle of a stanza, I finally fired him. Although it's,
Yeah.
again, not entirely clear what the final straw was, whether it was after this incident or whether it took a little more time before she just had to walk away, find somebody else.
And the fact that she starts by describing him physically in a way that makes him reveals his wretchedness, as you said, Saul. And then that line, I laughed and said, "Have you heard of the Great Molasses Flood?" And that laughing, like that's a painful line for me because I feel like that is the patient reaching out and trying to connect. And
It's my
she's
favorite
trying,
line.
yeah, I mean she's like trying to use all of her human skills, of which she has many, to connect to this guy, and he shuts it right down. It's just painful.
It's a somber poem, and I think it's beautifully crafted. And we have a second one by this excellent physician interviewer, Lorraine Herwald, who's made these found poems. So wonder if we could turn to that now. It's
Sure. The poem is entitled This Pseudo Thing, and it's from the interview with Arthur Frank, who is a famous sociologist who spent most of his career in Canada. And he was a medical sociologist, and he himself suffered several very serious illnesses. First, a heart attack at a fairly young age, and then cancer. And actually, after that, sarcoidosis, which he thought was a recurrence of cancer. The title of the poem is This Pseudo Thing. When he is talking, I think about his cancer diagnosis. Okay, so it reads, I believed when I was really sick, the system would slow down. People would pay attention to me. I found exactly the opposite. When I was really sick, I made people much more nervous. They wanted to leave my room much faster. Medicine became truly impersonal. Not always, obviously, not always. Not my thoracic surgeon, but in a lot of other cases. When they would try to be personal, it was just this pseudo thing. Before the mediastinoscopy, this nurse doing the pre-op stuff asked, how are you and your wife coping? Really, we are doing very badly. Very badly. Well, talk to each other. She turned and left.
oh God.
Yeah.
Oy vey. What's your favorite line, Laura?
I think my favorite line is very badly because
Yeah.
the whole sentence reads, really, we're doing very badly, but that second very badly sits in its own line,
hmm
nothing else surrounding it. Because the nurse is asking a conventional question, how are you doing? And it turns out she's not really expecting a real answer, but he gives her a real answer, which is not only, like, oh, it's rough or we're struggling. It's like, we're doing very badly. Repeat, own line, very badly. Like, this is somebody really trying to communicate distress. And then the response is so not up to that.
Well, talk to each other.
Yeah. Like, oh, thanks.
So tell me what your favorite line is on this one too.
I concur. It's the very badly followed by the very badly, but juxtaposing that with, well, talk to each other. I had a godfather, Simon, who's a family physician. And when I was sometimes visiting Simon and we were in the supermarket, and Simon was one of those people who just did not hold people at a distance. And when you go through the checkout line, they usually say, Now they say paper or plastic, but but they also typically say, "How are you today?" And you're supposed to say, "I'm fine, thank you," and that's the convention. And Simon would generally say something like, "Do you really want to know?" And he didn't say it in any kind of
God.
he didn't say it in like a snarky way. And what always struck me was that the cashier would look up and they would say something like, "Yeah." And then he would tell them. And honestly, Simon was usually having a pretty good day. That's just the kind of person he was. But he would tell them, and there would be a little exchange between the two, it'd be a little personal, and he'd move on. And I mentioned this to him after seeing it a couple of times. And I said, "Why do you say, do you really want to know?" Because it could sound snarky. And he said, "Well, sometimes I can think of times where they've said to me, no, I don't. I can think of at least one case where that happened." And I said, "What did you say?" And he said, "Is it that bad?" And I initially I didn't quite know what he was getting at, but I think
Simon said it to the cashier who
Simon
said
said,
no.
"Is it that bad?" And there was just quiet. And I think what Simon appreciated was that the cashier was not ready in that moment for emotion or for whatever might come. They had been taught that you're supposed to say, "How are you today?" But probably a lot was going on in that person. And Simon understood that. This was not offensive to him. He was not offended that it was disingenuous. He understood that the person was trained to ask that question. And he appreciated there was a lot going on and that sometimes you just don't want to hear what other people are doing. But keep in mind, that's a cashier. That's not your doctor.
Yeah.
That's not your nurse.
Right.
And so when we take that over to this, where the nurse, who is supposed to be there for a different reason other than to ask you how you want your groceries bagged, says, "How are you and your wife coping?" And then when you come back with something that's heavy, like very badly, you see her shut down. Well, talk to each other. Meaning I don't really want to go there. And again, to me, this adds another layer of evidence, now that we're on the third poem, to what I see as a recurring theme across all three of these, which is the need to protect the doctor, to play along with a script,
Or the
because the
nurse, I
doctor, in
guess.
this case the nurse, is not ready, is fragile in some way, and can't go there, and so we can't do that.
Somebody listening to this is going to say, whether it's a nurse or a doctor, they have this list of things to do in a certain amount of time. And what the hell are you expecting, Saul? You've held forth at length here, but doesn't she have another patient she's supposed to, I don't know, settle or chart? Aren't we being unfair here?
I think that is the most common answer you get, which is that we're very busy, we don't have time. And I think the myth of that is that being present for other people takes time. It's not time. It's a state of when you're present for other people. It's a way of being. It's not a set of tasks. I think that in some ways it's an evasive response. Whenever physicians and nurses say, "Well, I'm sorry, we're just very busy." I don't think they really capture. So, when, for example, we go back to to Simon being in the checkout line, he didn't slow the line down. He didn't slow
Yeah.
the line down. It didn't actually cause a backlog. They just kept going. But it was that moment of engagement, that recognition of the person's humanity.
The notion of doctors trying to protect themselves reminds me of there's a guy named Robert Murphy who was, I think, an anthropologist who had a terrible tumor that paralyzed him and he was confined to a wheelchair. But he wrote this piece called The Damaged Self about what it's like to be disabled. And there's a passage for him where he's talking about that he was in Africa and doing field work, and that he would see people missing hands and feet. And he says, the plight of those people was as alien to me as were their language, culture, and circumstances. Because of this gulf, I had no empathy for them, and just enough sympathy to drop coins into cups extended from the ends of stumps. A few pennies were all it took to buy the dubious grace of almsgiving. It was a bargain, a gesture that did not assert my oneness with them, but rather my separation from them. And he says then later, I mean, that's the before. And then he talks about from the perspective of somebody who is disabled how you have to behave. And he says, as the price of normal relations, meaning normal relations with able bodied people, they must comfort others about their condition. The unsound of limb are permitted only to laugh. For the rest of the world, I must sustain their faith in their own immunity by
Oh,
looking
wow.
resolutely cheery. Okay, so I'm the disabled one. I have to comfort you because you're frightened and you want to believe you're immune. And that costs me even more.
So the patient has to engage in a performance.
In Frank's book, At the Will of the Body, Reflections on Illness, there's a couple of paragraphs that get to the heart of what we're seeing here across all of these described experiences. So, Laura, if you could read that for us, that would be great.
Okay, so here he's talking about after he had his heart attack the first time at a young age, he was talking to his doctor on the phone about the situation. And he's talking about his doctor acting professional. And he says, to be professional is to be cool and management oriented. Professional talk goes this way. A problem seems to have come up, more serious than we thought, but we can still manage it. Here's our plan. Any questions? Hearing this talk, I knew full well I was being offered a deal. If my response was equally cool and professional, I would have at least a junior place on the management team. I knew that as patient choices go, that wasn't a bad deal, so I took it. I was even vaguely complimented. I did not yet know the cost of taking that deal. Experiences are to be lived, not managed. The body is not to be managed even by myself. My body is the means and medium of my life. I live not only in my body, but also through it. No one should be asked to detach his mind from his body and then talk about this body as a thing out there. No one should have to stay cool and professional while being told his or her body is breaking down, though medical patients always have to do just that. The demand being made of me was to treat the breakdown as if fear and frustration were not part of it, to act as if my life, the whole life, had not changed.
Well, that reminds me a bit of the Anya Silver poem from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Um,
It's the Anya Silver poem that made me think about this passage. I mean, when she
hmm.
says, I want her to see the meat of me, the wick, she's insisting blood and body is real and part of this, and don't ask me to hold it at a distance and treat it objectively.
But of course, that's what we're trained to do in medical school. Like, I mean, part of me wants to say this whole ability to describe function and dysfunction and structure and pharmacology and which consultant does what, this whole language, this whole apparatus is precisely why we're good at what we do. I mean, you wouldn't want us to not do it, would you?
That's true, but it's not also supposed to necessarily be a crutch for
Yeah.
not seeing the humanity of the patient and for holding them at a distance. And it often is, I think, a crutch. And I think that's what the poets here are conveying to us. It's as if they're all responsible for protecting the fragility of the physician. They have to play this game where they're not supposed to
Hmm.
upset the apple cart and stay within this protected boundary of language. And there's clearly nothing about the science of medicine that requires that. The science of medicine requires analytical thinking, evidence-based practice, but it does not require that become a little box where the physician is fearful of leaving. And he says here that he's complimented for being willing to not talk about anything else. He's allowed to be a member of the team. When I've asked residents who are the patients who you like most seeing in clinic, what they will typically say is that they like the patients who appreciate them, who say, well, doctor, you're just terrific. I really, wonderful. That's what they like. And there's nothing wrong with that. But a lot of patients aren't going to act that way because they're sick. They feel terrible.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
like making the physician feel great is not on their top 10 list. And so they might be angry, bitter. And the physician who can't see that, who takes it personally, is in some ways dangerous because they are going to react negatively. If you're sick, you want to be your doctor's favorite patient. It's very fearful to think that you might say something or do something that's going to make your doctor not want to be around
Yeah.
you, because
Yeah.
they have perhaps your life in their hands, and because there's an enormous power imbalance. And so the fragility of the doctor becomes an enormous burden and
Yeah.
threat to the patient. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we producing physicians who are so limited in this way?
I try to demonstrate the fact that I am genuinely interested in patients. That is, I model a certain kind of extroverted, genuine interest. And I know that people get to see that sometimes when I see the patient with a nurse or with a resident or with a colleague. But I also think, wait a second, I mean, that's a lot of personal style. And a lot of people have a temperamental construction that's different from mine. So I don't know how to help them. Like,
So I don't think they're implying that there has to be one way in which a physician is present for a patient, and only that they can be present. I think there are many ways that you can be present for another person, and it's going to come out in some way that's part of who you are. Different people are present in different ways because it reflects their individuality. I think what Frank is writing about is this phenomenon, which is all too common, of physicians having to hold patients at arm's length, and that fragility that requires that. I also think that this is not necessarily an either or. I think it occurs across a continuum. I think some physicians are somewhere in the middle, where they're sort of okay up to a point. They can be kind and present, but the patient will intuitively sense the limit. They'll sense that it's okay to sniffle a little, but it's not okay to lose it. And that's going too far. That could be too disruptive to the relationships. I think we're often very sensitive of when we're suffering and when we're in pain, of what we can reveal and what we can't reveal. And I think the issue in the doctor-patient encounter is the extraordinary power imbalance and the incredible dependence of the patient on the physician for the important role they play in that person's life. And so it way ups the ante from the reality that people with life-threatening disease experience whenever they talk about it, anywhere. Anya Silver, there's a YouTube where she talks about some of her poems, and she talks about the fact that those who have metastatic cancer terrify people. It's a general phenomenon. It's just that when it happens with your doctor, the stakes are so much higher. And what's expected of us as physicians should be so much greater than what's expected of, say, your neighbor.
is it
That
too
I
tall an
think,
order?
yeah.
Are you just
What's
being too
that?
demanding, Saul? Are you just being too demanding? Laura, do you think he's calling for us to be a little bit too much?
I was just thinking, because I was remembering your comment that, well, you have this kind of extroverted way of dealing with people, and that works for a bunch of people, but it
I
doesn't
do.
work for some others. And then what do you do, right? And my assumption is that if you really want to connect with anybody, engage with anybody, it requires a certain level of vulnerability.
Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's that willingness to be vulnerable, and it's the fear of vulnerability that
Yeah,
is the problem here. And the
yeah,
question is when that person is, quote, extroverted, is that a cover that they use to
right.
protect themselves and not be vulnerable, or are they extroverted but also vulnerable? I don't think those two are necessarily
Oh,
incompatible.
agreed. Yeah,
But vulnerability is, I mean, extroversion is often used as a cover to
Yeah,
protect oneself from
that's true.
vulnerability. And so I think what we're really getting at here is being present is being vulnerable. And that's what physicians are so unprepared for. We could talk about why that may be. It's part of our culture. Remember, people who go to medical school are part of the culture before they get there. And then medical schools do so much to condition them in ways that I think undermine their comfort with being vulnerable and present in the face of suffering. What we see from these poems is the devastating effect that has on people who have life-threatening illness and who really need a doctor who's there for them, or a nurse.
yeah,
I certainly think we could do better. I think vulnerability is probably the key. And even as an extrovert, one of the key questions to ask is, did I say the wrong thing? Did I listen in the right way? Did I really hear what you said there? Can you tell me if I got that right? I mean, those are all reasonable questions to ask if you're unsure where things are at. Just ask
yeah.
and be open to the possibility you got it wrong.
I think this is an issue with with any relationship where there's a power imbalance, this talk about vulnerability makes me think about being a teacher, and where I have the power to assign grades to students, and that when I'm at my best as a teacher is when I'm really open. You don't have to be bleeding in front of anybody, but just be genuinely open. And I will say that I struggle with that too. It's a scary thing to be
Yeah.
vulnerable. But is that a fair thing to ask in these jobs? I think it is.
I think that for people who are not sure how to be vulnerable with patients or with anyone, and they're just not sure what that means, I think the suggestion that comes to mind, and I think you alluded to this a moment, Stefan, is simply to ask questions.
Yeah.
And so if we go back to the classic example, the poem, the classic example, when she says, "Have you heard of the Great Molasses Flood?" Instead of saying, "Is it pertinent?" all he had to say was, "No, I haven't. Tell me about it."
Yeah. Yep.
And that's all. That's all.
Yeah, that's not hard. That's not hard.
But if you are so insecure that you don't want to even acknowledge that there's something you may not know,
Yeah.
Yep.
which is, I think, where we're starting here, that's a very primitive place to be for somebody with the responsibility, in this case, of a physician or a healer, somebody who's there under these circumstances. If they can't even say, "I don't know what the Great Molasses Flood is. Can you tell me about it?" And so that's all. Just ask.
I think fear blocks vulnerability.
Yeah.
That
In learning the medical interview, there were some patients brought in to Mass General Ambulatory Care Center for us first-year medical students, and we were videotaped in the interviews, or maybe we were watched. I'm not sure which, but one of the teachers was a very famous guy named John Stokel, and we were doing an interview with somebody who had a very difficult life situation, I think with very severe pain or something went wrong in his care. And in the interview, the patient got to a point where they were on the verge of tears, and I steered the conversation carefully away from that topic.
yeah. Yeah.
And I was, and I was, after the interview, there was a debrief with all of us together, the students and Dr. Stokel and somebody else. And he said, what happened there? And I said, well, you looked like he was going to cry. And he said, what would have been the effect of that on you? And I was like, well, I was scared. And he said, yeah, patients do cry sometimes. That's kind of going to be part of the job. You should be okay with that. That was it.
Yeah. Fear blocks curiosity.
Got it. Yes.
Because I mean, and I do try to remember this. I mean, the first time I listened that I read Saul's book, I just kept on thinking how much it applied to teaching and how much my fear blocked my curiosity. And it really is simple. Just to be genuinely open and curious. Tell me more. They might say things that hurt your feelings a little bit or whatever, but I mean, to try to put that aside and just say, I'm interested. I want to know. And that is, God, if you can remember that, that's a lot.
If the person starts crying and you're not sure what's going on, you can say, I see you're crying, and can you tell me what you're crying about?
Yeah.
Are you comfortable sharing that with me? Curiosity, it's with the willingness to lean in as opposed to pulling back.
Yeah.
The flicking the tissues at the person is
Yep.
That's the pulling back. It's the formality. They still need the tissues.
Well, and
So,
even flick it pushes away,
Pushes away, exactly.
Flicking is a defensive maneuver.
Yeah. I think if we want our future physicians to be comfortable, we have to help during the time that they're going through training. We have to help them not be afraid. And one of the ways we do that is by showing our own our own limitations and the fact that we don't always have the answers.
So I think this has been an incredibly helpful exploration of those poems. And I want to emphasize that line from Bianca Spriggs that I said at the beginning is, once a poem gets under your skin, you can't unread it. So I'm very thankful for the conversation that both of you have provided, especially for having our repeat guest, Professor Laura Greene.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, guys.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.